it's one of the most versatile vehicles on Earth, being used in getaways, ambulances, racing cars, everything you can imagine. This vehicle has done it all. It is the Ford Transit. Now, the name Transit dates back to 1953 in Germany's Ford division, called the Taunus Transit, based on a little Ford Taunus car. It was slow, terrible to turn, bulky, and wasn't very practical. So, they revamped it, shall we say. And in 1965, the official Transit Mark I came out in Britain. And it was an instant classic for several reasons. First, it was very similar to the Taunus. It was based on a car platform, meaning it outhandled every other van in its class. It had, and since the track width for the wheels was wider, it made a massive cargo space in the back. It had anywhere from 43 horsepower to 65 horsepower, meaning you could tow and carry a lot of stuff with an impressive 91 torque. And in emergency vehicles, like the police and ambulances, they got 120 horsepower V6s. Now, speaking of the police, they had an interesting statistic. Since the Transit was so popular, and so fast, and so good at storing stuff, it made it ideal for criminals. It turns out in the 1960s, 95% of British robberies were conducted at the hands of a transit. So, it was very popular for reasons the police weren't too happy about. This is also the longest lasting transit, having only one facelift in the 1970s before being discontinued in 1986 with a new generation, the Mark II. Now, the Mark II lasted from 86 to 2003, and it had the standard upgrades for a van: more storage space, better shocks to carry more stuff. It had new engines, 16-valve engines to get 145 horsepower. And if you think, well, that's a lot considering the original start, it is. But the Jags, decided to use it for a different purpose other than carrying things. You see, they wanted to test their new supercar chassis, the XJ220. So instead of going to the Nürburgring or to the Top Gear test track or something like that, they decided to put the guts of it, the all-wheel drive V12 twin-turbo, into the back of a Transit. So what we have here is an all-wheel drive, mid-engine V12 twin-turbo Transit, making almost 600 horsepower. And the way they tested it is they drag race it off the start line, and you can see here, this is a Ferrari 458 Speciale. I widely regard it as one of my favorite and best supercars of the last 30 years. And the Transit just walks away. It just walks away like it isn't even trying. And they did have a facelift which transitioned into the Mark III in 2000. The 0 to 60 time was a blistering 21 seconds with a top speed of 91 miles an hour. But that wasn't, of course, the key focus of it, because it got a better edition engine, 5-cylinder engines, to be more efficient. It had again, more storage space, better suspension, more luxuries for the price. And it had, and as a result of all of this, it won the International Van of the Year award. Yeah. Well done, Ford, well done. And they made, and it was so successful, in 2011 they made the Transit Connect spin-off, almost like a minivan. Not a minivan, but like a mini version of a van. And because they won the International Van of the Year, they decided to do the exact opposite of a minivan. A mega van, the Transit XXL Limo Edition. Because why not? A limo van that's over $150,000. It was a one-off special. And although it's focusing on, towing capacity, carrying capacity, amenities, and, awards, it didn't stop it from having a bit of performance history, because the Queen of the Nürburgring, Sabine Schmidt, I think that's how you pronounce it, Sabine Schmidt? I don't know, set a Nürburgring lap record of 10 minutes and 8 seconds in a very lightly modified Ford Transit for a Top Gear episode. And it held that record, until 2018, so almost 10 years it held that record. Well done. Well done indeed. And that brings us on to the current Mark IV Transit. Most things are the same on it. They have similar amenities, but they do have a few new versions, a mid-size front-wheel drive and a full-size rear-wheel drive to go along with them. The previous generations, they had another 600 pounds increase in payload. That's like a small car in the back. No, that's pretty darn impressive. And it has a 3.5 liter EcoBoost V6 from the F-150. And that means that it is rather quick. You see, that 3.5 liter EcoBoost V6 makes 310 horsepower, 400 foot-pounds of torque, and a 0 to 60 in less than 7 seconds in a van. And it even comes in British Racing Green. How perfect is that? And since it's an F-150 engine, and there's tuners for the F-150, you can easily get that van engine tuned to make over 420 horsepower and 470 torque in a van. A road-legal van. That's just ridiculous. But it's not the craziest Transit ever made. You see, we have to rewind a bit to the 1970s, when the refresh for the Mark I was happening. So, a bunch of engineers at Ford Europe were bored, and they stumbled across a GT40 in their back lot. And they thought, what if we combine this with the Transit that we have lying around? I think that's a brilliant idea. So, that's what they did. They made a mid-engine, 400 horsepower V8 Transit Mark I. Crazy fender flares, widened wheels, slight lane weight, more roll cage. And it had a top speed in 1971, a van-ish, had a top speed of 150. That sounds terrifying. And it was terrifying. It was so difficult to drive through the corners, they rarely took it around a track, and they mainly used it for promotional drag races. And it lasted in the spotlight for over 10 years until the Transit Supervan II was made in 1984 for the new Mark II revamp. And you see, there was another thing going on in the 1980s called Group C Le Mans. We'll get to that in a later episode. And Ford was going to be a part of it with this, the C100 Le Mans Racer. It had a 591 horsepower inline 4 from a Zack Speed Capri. And what they did, in order to celebrate the launch of the Transit Mark II, was put a fiberglass replica Transit body on the chassis of a Group C Le Mans racer. Because why not? And then they simply threw a bunch of aero on that van. And the result was a absolute monster. On the straights at Silverstone when they were driving around for a demonstration, it reached 175 miles per hour. In a van-ish. It's one of the most bizarre sights in the world. I absolutely love it. It's amazing. But that van only lasted 1 year because 1985 they had a new van, a new super van, the Mark III van. And this thing, it had the same chassis as the C100, but they swapped out the 591 horsepower V inline 4 for an even crazier Formula 1 Cosworth V8. Which produced 650 horsepower and a screaming 13,000 RPM. Yeah, that engine, Power McLaren in 1991, I believe. Absolutely mental engine. I love it. Now, eventually, they did have to replace the engine just for sake of, not stalling and not breaking it all the time. So they replaced it with a measly 400 horsepower V6. And with the slower engine, this van went 150 miles an hour. And this Transit Supervan was appearing in public demonstrations until 2003. And then that was it. That was the last of the Supervans. They hadn't make any more for the Mark IV, Mark III Transit update, and it was quite sad. Until 2011, when they made the Transit Super Sport van. Now this is a one-off special, and it wasn't quite as crazy in any way, shape, or form as the F1 V8 monsters of the past. It had a measly 200 horsepower from the van's stock engine of a 3.2 liter 5-cylinder, which, I mean, 200 horsepower from a van engine is not too shabby. And it had an impressive 330 pounds-feet of torque, and an upgraded suspension and an upgraded gearbox tuned by Ford Racing. And in fact, it was actually road legal. It was running on sport tires, so it was technically road legal, being the first super sport van to ever be legal on the road. But they never made any of them. It's a shame. It looks cool, it's fast, and it's very unique, but they never made them. It's being used by criminals, racing drivers, or the everyday public. This vehicle was one of the most influential in the history of the British motoring industry, making the average consumer and the average business owner able to expand their business much further than they ever imagined, much more comfortably as well. And the result of all these crazy engines and tuning and van awards, 8 million units sold. That's pretty darn good. And it remains as the benchmark for all vans internationally. Will we see another super van? Who knows? But that kind of makes the previous all the more legendary. And it kind of makes you want a British Racing Green 300 horsepower Transit, even if you don't need one.